Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're heading into the Korean countryside, to a place where the old rules still matter, where shortcuts aren't just disrespectful, they're dangerous. This story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the longest path is the only safe one, and that when an elder tells you to walk around, not over, you listen. This happened on a November night in 2022, on a stretch of rural road between Jongsun and Yongwol. Let's begin. The bus broke down at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, engine ticking down to silence on a gravel shoulder halfway up a valley pass. I'd been dozing against the window, my forehead pressed to cold glass that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and someone else's hair oil, when the driver's apology crackled through the overhead speaker. Mechanical trouble, dispatch notified, wait time uncertain. Outside, fog was climbing the terraced hills in sheets, erasing the lower slopes one ridge at a time. The valley was stitched with narrow earthen mounds, low burial hills that rose in careful rows along the contours, each one marked by a small stone bowl and the occasional fruit peel left as an offering. At the head of every footpath that cut between the terraces stood a tall wooden totem gatepost, carved faces watching the road with expressions I couldn't quite read in the dark. Somewhere up the slope, wind chimes rang out, a clear metallic note that sounded much closer than the wind that should have carried it. There were 11 of us on the bus. The driver stayed in his seat, texting dispatch and flipping through a laminated route card clipped to his visor. The rest of us gathered near the front door, breath fogging in the cold air that seeped through the folding doors. A college girl in a puffer jacket checked her phone and announced there was no signal. A middle-aged man in a business coat suggested we walk to the village, visible on the next ridge. Maybe 15 minutes on foot if we took the main road. An older woman, she must have been 70, dressed in a quilted vest and canvas hiking boots, shook her head slowly and said the fog would close the road before we made it halfway, that we needed to take the hill paths, the ones that crossed between the mounds. She pointed to a reflective kilometer marker just beyond the gravel verge, where a footpath began, marked by one of those wooden totem posts. A laminated notice was zip-tied to the post, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I couldn't read it from where I stood, but the old woman said it clearly. Walk around, not over. Respect the resting. She made it sound like a law, not a suggestion. The group didn't want to listen. The businessman said it would take too long, that the mounds were small enough to step across, that we'd freeze if we wound around every single grave on the hillside. The college girl agreed, scrolling through her phone even though there was no signal, just the blue glow of a downloaded map that showed the village as a cluster of pixels 2 ridges away. A younger guy in a delivery company jacket said his girlfriend was waiting for him in Yongwol, and he couldn't afford to miss the connection. The old woman didn't argue. She just looked at me, and I felt the weight of it, the expectation that I'd back her up, that I'd say something to slow the group down. But I've never been good at that. I've spent my whole life nodding along, going with the majority, keeping the peace because it's easier than standing alone. So I stayed quiet, and the businessman stepped off the gravel shoulder and onto the footpath, and within 3 strides, he'd hopped directly over the first low mound, his boot landing on the other side with a soft crunch of dry grass. The wind chimes rang again, and this time, the pitch was different, higher, sharper, like a note that had been tuned to match something specific. The businessman paused and looked back at us, and for a second I thought he was going to apologize, but instead he just waved us forward and kept walking. The college girl followed, then the delivery guy, then 2 more passengers I hadn't really looked at before. I hung back with the old woman and 2 others, a man in his 50s carrying a canvas shoulder bag and a teenage boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The old woman led us to a second footpath, one that curved along the edge of the terraces instead of cutting straight across. She moved slowly, her boots finding purchase on the uneven ground, and she pointed out the boundary stones as we passed them. Small granite markers, no bigger than a fist, set into the earth at intervals to show where one family's resting ground ended and another's began. The totem gateposts stood at every junction, their carved faces turned toward the paths, and I finally got close enough to one to read the laminated notice. Terrace graves, walk the perimeter, do not cross mounds. Village Council, autumn 2019. By the time we reached the second ridge, the fog had thickened to the point where I could barely see 10 meters ahead. The old woman stopped and tilted her head, listening, and I heard it too, the wind chimes again. But now they were ringing from multiple directions, overlapping notes that didn't quite harmonize. She frowned and muttered something I didn't catch, then kept moving, slower now, her hand trailing along the rough wood of a totem post as if checking its position. Behind us, the teenage boy asked if we were lost, and the man with the canvas bag said no. The old woman knew these paths. She'd walked them her whole life. I wanted to believe him, but my phone buzzed in my pocket. A dispatch SMS from the bus company, automatic and impersonal. Assistance nearby. Estimated arrival, 22:15. I checked the time, 10:31. The blue dot on my downloaded map showed our location, but it was frozen, stalled halfway between the road and the village, as if the system couldn't decide where we actually were. Ahead, through the fog, I saw movement, figures emerging from a parallel path, the ones who'd cut straight across the mounds. The businessman was in front, his coat dusted with pollen or ash, and the college girl was right behind him, her puffer jacket zipped all the way up. They looked fine, unhurt, but when the delivery guy called out to the businessman by name, "Junseo, wait up," the businessman didn't respond. He just kept walking, his gait slightly off, as if he were compensating for a limp he didn't have before. The college girl turned to look at us, and her face was pale, her expression blank, and when the man with the canvas bag said, "Are you okay, miss?" she blinked twice and said, "I'm fine." But her voice didn't match. It was too flat, too careful, like someone reading a script they'd memorized but didn't understand. The old woman stopped walking. She pulled a small flashlight from her vest pocket and aimed it at the ground near the businessman's feet. There, in the damp earth, I saw a kicked boundary stone, half buried, and a few meters away, a low mound with a fresh divot where someone's boot had landed squarely on top. The stone bowl that should have been at the head of the mound was tipped over, the offering inside, a bruised persimmon and a folded paper note, scattered in the dirt. The old woman knelt down slowly, her knees cracking, and she righted the bowl, smoothed the earth, and reset the boundary stone with both hands. She didn't say anything, but the wind chimes shifted pitch again, this time lower, settling into a tone that felt less urgent, almost patient. The businessman looked at her and said, "We should keep moving." But when the delivery guy said, "Junseo, let's wait for the others," the businessman's face went blank, and he said, "Who's Junseo?" The delivery guy stared at him. You're Junseo. You told me your name at the rest stop." The fog thickened further, and the old woman stood up, brushing dirt from her palms. She motioned for us to keep moving, to follow the perimeter path, and I did, even though every instinct told me to catch up with the others, to stay with the group, to not be the one left behind. But I'd spent too long following the crowd, and tonight, for the first time in years, I chose the longer path. The teenage boy stayed with me, and so did the man with the canvas bag, and together we walked the curve of the hill, stepping carefully around each mound, keeping the boundary stones on our left. The totem gateposts watched us pass, their carved faces impassive, and the wind chimes rang softly now, a background hum that didn't feel threatening anymore, just present, like the sound of someone keeping time. We reached the village at 11:42. It was barely a village, just a cluster of low houses around a small community hall with a tin roof and a single electric light above the door. Others were already there, standing in a loose group on the concrete pad outside the hall, their faces lit by the yellow glow. The businessman, the college girl, the delivery guy, and two more passengers I hadn't paid attention to on the bus. They looked cold and tired, but whole. The man with the canvas bag walked up to the delivery guy and said, "Good, you made it." And the delivery guy looked at him and said, "Who are you?" The man stopped. "We've been sitting across from each other for 2 hours. I'm Sang-min. You borrowed my phone charger at the rest stop." The delivery guy shook his head slowly. "I don't know you," he said, and his voice was his own, familiar and tired, but the words didn't fit. The college girl pulled out her phone and unlocked it, staring at the screen, and her lock screen photo showed her with a group of friends. But when she looked at the faces, she said softly, "I don't remember their names." The old woman didn't go inside. She walked past the community hall to a narrow path that led up the slope behind the building, and I followed her, the teenage boy and Sang-min close behind. The path ended at a small clearing dotted with more earthen mounds, these ones older, their edges softened by grass and moss. At the center of the clearing stood a wooden shrine, barely bigger than a phone booth, with a sloped roof and a shallow offering table. The old woman knelt in front of the shrine and lit a small bowl of incense from a matchbook in her pocket, the smoke curling upward into the fog. She spoke quietly, words I couldn't fully hear, and then she turned to me and said, "Walk the circle. Around, not over. Say their names if you know them. Say your own if you don't." I didn't understand, but I did it anyway. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, stepping carefully around each mound, and I said my name aloud, once at the start, once at the midpoint, once at the end. The teenage boy did the same. Sang-min followed. The wind chimes rang one final time, a single clear note that hung in the air and then faded. And when we walked back down to the community hall, the delivery guy looked at Sang-min and said, "Hey, thanks for the charger earlier." And the college girl unlocked her phone and smiled at the lock screen photo and said her friend's name softly, like she was reminding herself. The bus arrived at 6:15 in the morning, the fog burned off by pale November sun. The driver apologized again, explained the part that had failed, and we all climbed back on, our clothes damp and our faces numb from the cold. As we pulled away from the village, I looked out the window and saw the terraced hills in daylight, the mounds small and ordinary, marked by stone bowls and fresh offerings. The totem gateposts stood at the path junctions, their carved faces turned toward the road, and I heard the faint sound of wind chimes, but this time it was mixed with the clatter of goat bells and the clang of kitchen pans from the houses below. The businessman sat 3 rows ahead of me, scrolling through his phone. and the college girl was asleep against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. But I knew that something had shifted in the hours between breakdown and dawn, that the fog and the graves and the old woman's quiet authority had drawn a line I hadn't seen before, and that I'd chosen, for once, to stay on the right side of it. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. In rural Korea, grave customs aren't just tradition. They're a form of respect that runs deeper than convenience. When you walk around a burial mound instead of over it, you're acknowledging that someone rests there, that their name and their family and their story deserve space. The totem gateposts aren't decorations. They're boundary setters, marking the thresholds between the living and the dead, between the paths we're meant to take and the shortcuts we're tempted by. And I think that's true in a broader sense too. We live in a world that's always pushing us to take the fastest route, to go along with the crowd, to skip the steps that feel unnecessary. But sometimes the longer path is the one that protects someone else's rest and your own name. If you ever find yourself in a place where the old rules still matter, where an elder tells you to walk around, not over, listen. Choose the perimeter. Take the time. Because the cost of a shortcut isn't always visible until it's too late. And by then, you might not remember who you were when you started. Thanks for listening tonight. Take care of yourselves and each other. I'll see you in the next one.